now. Take it away.
Thank you. So I wanted to do an episode on custom reports for a very long time. Um, we're just waiting for the right timing, and I'm glad that it is now. So we're going to talk about, before I jump to the product, I want to talk about some of the theory stuff, just because it's important to know that there is kind of a little bit of a science behind understanding how QuickBooks reports work. So the first couple of things is there are four types of reports in QuickBooks, and I'm kind of focused on QuickBooks Desktop. I know the slide says QuickBooks Desktop and Online, so I'm going to focus on QuickBooks Desktop for now because Online has some different nuances here. But in QuickBooks Desktop, there's going to be four types of reports. There's going to be a summary report, which does not contain any transaction information. It contains the total of all the transactions, summing to that amount based on the filters that we're using. Then there's the detail report, and a detail report is going to be something like a open bill report, open invoice, something that contains actual line items. Then there's list reports. List reports do not contain transactions. They only contain vendor names, customer names, item names, account names. And then there's the special reports. Some of them can be filtered, some of them can't. That's why we call them special reports, because they have specific purposes and we really can't tweak them so much. So something like an AR aging, estimate versus actual stock inventory status, that would be considered a special report. So let me talk about the number one tip that I give all my students for the QuickBooks classes that I teach when we teach the reporting class. So before you build a summary report, the first thing I recommend is try to see if you can draw the report on a piece of paper first. I would say that's like the most important thing. Can you draw the report? Can you visualize in terms of what's going to be in the columns, what's going to be in the rows, and what specific data you want to see inside of the content? For example, for a report where you see months as the columns, that's one of your options. You're going to go to columns, month. And then when you see vendors on the rows, that's going to be one of your options. You're going to select rows vendors. Now, the specific data, if I only want to see cost of goods sold, that would be the filter that I want to use. So let me jump into the product real quick and talk about that specific example. So again, I want to have columns as months as the columns, total cost of goods sold as the actual body, the content, and I want vendors as the rows. So let me start by clicking on reports and then going down to custom reports and then clicking on summary. Okay, so that's kind of the first step to build a custom report. And then after I've drawn it and visualized it and I kind of know what I want, then I want to use all these components to build the report. So let's say I only want to see paid expenses. So I want to make sure that if I'm going to go with paid expenses, I'm going to select a cash report. That's kind of like the number one rule, because if I want to see paid, I'm going to switch to cash. Display columns by, this is where I will select month. And then display rows by, this is where I select vendor, right? Because I'm trying to see my total cost of goods sold by vendor by month. Then under date, I want to see this fiscal year. And then under filter, and this is kind of the key element here, under filter, I want to go to account. And remember, I only want to see cost of goods sold because I'm only looking for direct expenses. So I'm going to select this filter here called cost of sales. And then I'm going to hit OK. And then that would be the report that I was looking for. I'm looking for the vendor on the rows. I want to see the months on the columns, and I'm only looking for cost of goods sold. Now, something that's interesting about building a custom report. Let me go to the next slide here. I find it to be so that was my number one tip. Draw it first. My number two tip, my second tip is spend a good amount of time thinking about the title. Uh, I can't stress this enough how much of a time waster it is for you to build a great custom report that achieves everything you're trying to achieve, and you do a real crummy job coming up with the title, because then you print it and the user of the report just has no clue what they're looking at. So based on the report that we just built, the suggested title I would use would be paid direct expenses by vendor by month. Now, why? Because the title itself contains or suggests all the filters that we're using and all the settings that we're using. So that is the number one tip I would say, make sure that whatever name you give it, the whole name evokes all the filters that you're using. So before I save this report or before I print it, I'm gonna click here where it says memorize, and then I'm gonna give this the name. So this is gonna be, in this case, would be paid direct expenses. And again, direct expenses and cost of goods sold can be used interchangeably, by month, by vendor, something like that. Now, actually, I want to flip this and I'm going to say by vendor, by month. I like to put the time period at the end. Let me hit OK. And the reason why I do that is I'm going to hit refresh is because if I want to see this by quarter and I switch this to by quarter and then I go memorize this report again, when I click on new, I can just quickly change the name towards the end here. So by quarter. So that is sort of my number one and number two tip. Draw it out first and then spend a good amount of time coming up with the title. I can't stress enough how important these components are. Okay, let's go to my next tip and custom report, where we can talk about these theories that we have in place. So rows and columns will provide grouping like month, customer, class, vendor. We just did that. Now the key thing is I cannot have the same grouping type for both rows and columns. So that's a really important, really important a piece to know. When you draw out a report, you kind of have to know that it is not possible for you to have, for example, vendor here and then have customer here. QuickBooks doesn't allow you. Vendors and customers are both names. Because they're both names, if I hit OK, I cannot build a report like this. That's an important piece. Just like if I try to do employee or something like that. So I cannot cross a row with a name and a column with a different name. Now, I can't cross account, for example. So I can go vendor and account list. That I can do because this account list has to do with the chart of accounts. So balance sheet, summary, income statement, and account list, these four are the same group. It just means report or it means account. And then customer name, type, vendor type, employee, these are all considered to be the same group. So just kind of be careful when using those. Okay, I want to use a different example on custom reports where we use units, where we use quantity as the unit of measure. So let's go back to custom reports and let's do a summary. And then I want to see the number of products. I'm going to focus on just inventory products, for example, that I've sold during a particular period of time. So I'm going to select here this fiscal year. And then under columns, we'll do this quarterly. Under rows, I'm going to go ahead and select item detail. By the way, item detail, it just basically means item. And instead of showing the amount, I'm going to go ahead and show the quantity. That's what that filter does, the quantity. And then I'm going to click on filters and I'm going to go down to item and I'm going to select only inventory. So I'm just kind of focused on inventory items. And then I want to just go back to this account filter here, and I only want to see when the inventory items were sold. So I'm not really focused about when the inventory items were purchased or bought or something like that. So I'm going to just click on income as the category there. So just focus on income. So when I hit OK, then what do I get? And then I may be missing something in a filter here. So we're going to check that in a second. So what happens here is I get a report with the units and I'm missing a filter here, which we're going to do in a second. And the reason why this filter is not working is because if I double click on any of these, I'm actually, well, let me look for one that actually has, I'm actually seeing both the sort of the debit and the credit side of it. So I want to make sure that when I go back into that filter, that I pick the correct filter. Let me pick just all income, all ordinary income. That one should work. Let me hit OK. Oh, there it is. Okay. So once I hit all ordinary income, and that was kind of the issue there, I didn't have the right filter. So if I'm looking just for sales, I'm going to look for all ordinary income. By the way, these are negatives because these are credits, right? Because income are credits. That doesn't mean I sold -4. That actually means I sold 4. So basically, this gives you a good idea, and if I hit collapse, I hide all the sub accounts in this case, or the sub items, so I can open them. So this is a good interesting piece of reporting where I can see only units. Now if I go to back into customize report and select both in this case, and I hit OK, and let me just expand that again because I have sub items, I'm going to see the total sale amount, and I'm also going to see the total quantity. And don't pay attention to the negatives. That doesn't mean that they've been returned or anything like that. It just means that that's showing in terms of a credit. So that's really how you use quantity and amounts on custom reports. The other important piece is the filters. Right? The filters are what are going to narrow down the data. Now in QuickBooks Online, the terminology they use is lists. So just kind of keep in mind that it doesn't really use the filter. It uses the word list, but it's kind of used interchangeably. And then the other important piece is the subcolumns. Okay, these subcolumns sometimes they are misinterpreted. So I want to kind of talk about how these subcolumns work. So I'm going to pull a report. In this case, I'm going to do a sales report by customer. Okay. And then basically these are all my sales. And I'm going to go ahead and select as my date range, I'm going to select last month. So right now, let me collapse this for a second. So right now I'm looking at total sales by customer. And just so you know, the construction of this report, only invoices and sales receipts show here. So if you have any deposits going into the bank pointing to the customer, they don't show on this report. Anyway, when I click on custom report, I have a couple of different things here. I have previous period, I have previous year, and I have year to date. And I kind of want to walk through what all these are. Now, at any point in time that you do previous period is going to go backwards the same amount of time as your date range. So naturally, if I'm looking at last month, which is all of the month of November for the sample file, previous period is going to be October. And then if I do previous year, it's basically going to take the exact date range and just change the year. So in this case, it will show 2018. And then year to date will always take the fiscal year all the way through January through the end of the period. So that's the difference between previous period, previous month, and year to date. Now I'm going to go ahead and click customized report here and kind of show you in contrast. Let me take away year to date. And then instead of choosing last month, I'm going to choose a random date range. So I'm going to choose September 1st to September 10th, right? So I'll do September 1st to September 10th and just kind of illustrate what exactly this does. And there may not be many transactions here, but when I do a previous period and a previous period, okay, it's going to show me, in this case, October 20th to October 21st to October 31st or something like that. So it's going to go back exactly 10 days. And previous year is going to be the exact date range with 2018. So hope with that example, the subcolumns make total sense in that case. Keyword. Okay, so let's go to the next example that I wanted to talk about here. Is going to be on transaction detail reports. Now, one of the major areas of confusion in a transaction detail report is that columns and rows don't have the same context. So let me go to report and let me go to custom reports and I go to transaction detail report. Now, notice that in a transaction detail report, I don't get the rows and columns drop down like I do with the summary report because there's just much different behavior. In a transaction detail report, a column is talking about content inside of the transaction. And in the case of rows, the rows are actually the transactions are going to be displayed. So rows is not even an option. So let's talk about, for example, an open invoice report. Okay, so in a transaction detail report, when you talk about an open invoice report, filters are going to be a real key component. So I'm going to click here on dates and click all. So if I'm going to pull an open invoice report, for example, I have to make sure that I don't use cash basis. Cash basis will never work because cash basis shows me the payment portion of an invoice. So that won't even work. So I have to make sure that I stick on to accrual. Then I'm going to go to filters here. And if I want open invoices, then I need to make sure that, again, the title it's an open invoice report, so the title itself should contain the filters. So the word open means paid status, so that's the filter for open, right? So I'm going to leave here open. And then the other filter in this case is the word invoice, open invoice report. So I'm going to look for transaction type, and I'm going to hit the drop down here and click on invoice. Now, if you notice this little search box here, this was introduced back in QuickBooks 2015. So if you're working with an older version, you don't have the search box. You just have to kind of find them in there. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And that is an open invoice report. But in this particular case, I'm seeing both credits and debits. As you can tell here on this side, I'm seeing both credits and debits. So if I were to scroll all the way down, I get this just kind of this weird obscure number here. So maybe in an open invoice report, I don't want to see the details. I want to see just the overall balance of the open invoice. Now, what that basically means is that I am not interested on the splits, or I'm not interested on the targets. I'm interested only on the destination information. So in the cases, for example, this second invoice here, that a la Robert for 14,510, I'm actually not interested on the details of the 3150 or the 9240 or the 16. I'm not interested on that. I just want the overall invoice amount. That way I'm not cluttered with both debits and credits. So that's one of the hardest filters to master. So I'm going to click here on filter, which is the detail level. So I'm going to click on detail level, and this is pretty much everything revolving custom detail reports. It's dependent on what choice you make on this specific filter. This is in my opinion, the most important filter of a transaction detail report, because it determines what side of the transaction you want to see. So in the case of all, for example, I'm going to see both the source and the target, or the source and the split. If I go to summary, I only see the source, or I only see the accounts receivable side of the invoice. And if I click all except summary, then I'm going to see the items or the specific products that I sold. So in the case of an open invoice report, I'm interested in just invoice by invoice. So I'm going to click on summary only and then hit OK. And that is going to narrow it down to all of my invoices. Now, in this particular report, I am not seeing what portion of the invoice is open. As a matter of fact, here on the debit side, this is the original dollar amount of the invoice. So if I wanted to see whatever is open from the invoice itself, and just to kind of illustrate the point here for a second, if I wasn't doing this through a report, if I was going to the customer center, and then I was going into transactions, and then I was going into invoices, and then I was going to click on open invoices, and then I go here to open balance. See, the real open balance is 100, but let me put dates here. I'll put dates all. See, the real balance here is 120,000. If you see on that very last column, that's the actual open balance. 138 is the original invoice amount, right? So what I'm focused in for that specific report I was building, it's the 120,000. So what I need to do is I need to enable that particular column. So let me just get rid of a couple of columns here, just so I can open up some space for that when I do open it up, so there's no surprise. So let me just open this whole thing. There we go. And I'll click on customize report, and then I'm going to go down to balance. Basically, that's what I'm looking, but what I'm looking, it's open balance. So you see that little column there, that's the data point I want to bring in. It's open balance, and I hit OK, and then that will give me the open balance. So at this point, I could choose to just get rid of balance. I could choose to get rid of credit. I can choose to get rid of debit, depending on what I'm trying to achieve, right? And then at this point, I can memorize this report and call this open invoices, open balances only. So notice that I on the report title, open invoices, I'm including my filters, and then in parentheses, I'm sort of adding what information I'm seeing or not seeing. So I'm going to hit OK there to memorize that report. With, again, report titles are so important. Now, a couple of things that I would do here is, if I wanted to group this by customer, I would go to total by. Unfortunately, there's only one grouping dimension. I wish there was two at least or more, but this is it, right? So we have one grouping dimension. So I'm going to click on total by and then click on customer. And then I'm going to group these by customer or by job. And if I do this, then basically name becomes redundant, right? Because I'm going to see name appear and then name appear again. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of name at that point, right? And then also because I know these are open invoices, I guess type would also be redundant. So I'll get rid of that. So that basically lets me narrow down and see just much more concise information. So at this point, I see all my open invoices grouped by customers, by job, with only the information I'm looking, which is the actual open balance, the invoice number, and the date. So it's kind of a couple of examples of how you can start working with custom transaction detail reports. Okay, now, I want to talk about this concept of source and destination. And I wish I had more time, but I only got like 5 more minutes. So let me talk about the concept of source and destination. This is probably one of the most important pieces of information to know about a transaction detail report. So let me go to the next slide here. I think I have a pretty good illustration there. And basically, everything you see highlighted in red is considered to be a source. And by the way, the payee, it's also there. I just didn't put a box in there. So everything you see highlighted on red is the source data, and everything you see highlighted in green is the destination data or the split data. As a matter of fact, you can have four names for destination. So just in your mind, the word target, destination, split, or detail, they're all used interchangeably. And the word source and summary, it's both used interchangeably. So to illustrate this example of how source and destination works, and this is going to unravel a lot of mysteries about how reporting works. Let me go ahead and create a check here using that example. I think I already had done it. Oh, yeah, I should have done it. There it is. Okay. So again, as I mentioned earlier, so this vendor name here, that's on the source. The account that it came from, that's the source. The dollar amount of the entire check, that's the source. The class of the check, that's the source. The memo in the top of the check, that's the source. Now down here, the accounts of the split or the detail or the target, whatever name you want to use, this is the destination. So that's the account destination, that's the amount destination, and that's the memo of the destination, the customer of the destination, and the class of the destination. Well, so what do I mean by that? Let me go ahead and pull this report by hitting Control Y, and then I get basically my transaction journal. So on this report that I'm looking at, I'm seeing both the source and the destination. And some of the obvious components here are, for example, under memo and account. So as you can see, the name on the source is Hector. Hector is the vendor that we paid. And the memo is the one that says source memo. And let me just go back to that for a second. Let me put, this is the memo from the source. Okay, and then I'm gonna put here, this is the detail memo. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and hit save and close so we can see it on that report. And this is exactly what I want to illustrate here. Okay, so you see the memo that comes up is, this is a memo from the source, and then we see the memo of each specific line item, and you can see how they're illustrated with debit and credit, how they're set up with classes, and how they're set up with accounts. So if I was to filter this report, going back into the sample I was using, I'm going to click on Customize Report, click on Filter, and click on Detail Level. So I'll go back into how important this particular filter is. When I do a detail level, if I do a summary only and I hit OK, I'm only going to see the source. So I'm going to see the source vendor name, I'm going to see the source memo, the source account, and I'm going to see the source class. And the source dollar amount is a credit because this is a credit to the bank account. Okay. Let me hit on Customize Report and go to Filters, go to Detail Level, and in this case, let me select All Except Summary. Okay, so basically, it's not going to show me the source anymore. When I hit OK, I'm only going to see destination. However, this is one of the things that drives people insane is that this check wasn't written to customer. It was not written to Renee Bartley, and it was not written to Babcock Music. As a matter of fact, these are the names that we chose to job cost these accounts. However, because this name is part of the line item of the destination, we really don't have much of a choice. That's the name that we get. Now, if you wanted to still show the name that belongs to the from the source transaction, I would have to go into customize report, and I have to look for a special column called source name. So if I enable source name and I hit OK, then I get to see the actual vendor name that we paid on the check, although the names of the customers that we job costed to will show on the name column. So that source name is one of the everybody's pet peeves that doesn't show up by default. But it kind of, I think it illustrates pretty well how source and destination work on transaction detail report. So you want to think about how this works whenever you are pulling a report with classes. Because if you were, for example, let me go back and look at that check. Okay, so if I look at this check right here, if I look at this check, I know this is an overhead check. Okay, so if I were to naively try to pull this check information in a transaction detail report, in which I were going to use that filter. So I'm going to go to class and choose overhead, and then I was going to go to transaction detail or transaction type, sorry, and choose a check. And then I'll go to date and I'll choose today. So in theory, I should see that check in that type of report. And there it is, it's shown. But if I hadn't double check that when I'm looking at my detail level, if I would have chose all except summary or something for that matter, and I would hit OK, and I would not have gotten any information because the detail of those expenses are hitting different classes. So it's one of the crazy things that happens whenever you have a class on the source and a different class on the destination. So the other reports I want to kind of show you are the difference between a checklist, a check detail list, and a checklist with splits. So let's jump into QuickBooks Desktop here. Okay, and let me escape out of this. So let me go to Reports, Custom Reports, Transaction Detail. Okay, and then here under Dates, I'm going to go ahead and select all because I'm just not paying attention to dates for now. I'm going to click on Filters. Then I'm going to go to Transaction Type and limit this to checks. There we go. And then I'll hit OK. And then based on the different reports here, we're going to talk about checklist, check detail list, and checklist with splits. So the first one, the checklist, would just be this report that we just started. But I'm going to click on Customize Report, click on Filters, and then go to Detail Level, and then click Summary Only. And then I hit OK. And that would be a list of checks. That's it. That's a list of checks. Now, in the case of split, for checks that don't have more than one expense account associated with it, you're actually going to see the expense account. But for the ones that don't, you get to see the expense account in there. Either way, I'm just kind of focused on having purely a checklist here. So I'm going to get rid of all these columns, because all I'm trying to do is pull a checklist, and that's it. Okay, so that is an example of a list of checks, right? The other example, the other report that we wanted to pull was a check detail list. Okay, so the difference basically, it started with the same report, is when I go to Customize Report and click on Filter, instead of having a detail level of a summary only, then I would have an all except summary. So then I'm going to click OK. And then in this case, I actually closed the column with a debit. So let me go ahead and turn that back on, because we're actually going to need it at this point. And then this would be a check detail list. That means we don't get the source dollar amount, we get only the destination or the split amount. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on that to show you this check is actually $1,200. But because this is a check detail list, I don't get the 1200. I'm actually going to see check number 93 twice here. See that because there's two lines within the transaction. And then the last one would be a checklist with details. That would be having detail level all, and then I hit OK. And then at that point, I get to see, there you go, there's the 1200, that's the actual check. And then we have the 2600, which in this case is two specific line items. So that's the difference between having reports like that: checklist, check detail list, checklist with splits. Let's talk about the missing checks report and the missing invoice report. So there's a default report here on the reports menu and under banking called the missing checks. We go missing checks. And basically what this will give me is a continuation of checks, and it will kind of highlight every time a check number is skipped. Same thing goes with invoices. If I wanted to see if an invoice number is skipped, I start from this same missing checks report. I go to customize report, click on filter, and then I'll go to transaction type, and then instead of having it be a check, I would choose invoice. And then here under account, I'm going to go ahead and just select all, and then I hit OK. And basically that's going to give me all the every single time an invoice is skipped, right? So whatever research you have to do afterwards. See, in this case, they weren't even voided. They must have been duplicated or deleted. So in the case of duplicate invoice numbers, you can see them there. So that's the usefulness of that report. The next example is a retained earnings adjustment and audit trail. Okay, so this is a little bit of a tricky one. Okay, so for this one, I start with a balance sheet. And let me go ahead and start at the beginning of the year. So I kind of just want to focus on what retained earnings is at the beginning of the year. So we take that number, whatever that retained earnings amount is, 107,400. I'm going to take that number, and then I'm going to do a journal entry. So I'm going to go to company, make journal entry, and then I'll do 12/31/2018. Let's say that is the retained earnings locking that I want to do. And this is going to make a lot of sense once I finish, so I'll show you. So I'm going to go retain earnings, and I'm going to go ahead and take that away. So I'll put that, just copy that number over, and then I'll create another account. In this case, I called it RE, right? It's like another retained earnings account under equity. And all I'm doing is I'm moving the total retained earnings to a different retained earnings with the sole purpose that I can later on monitor if there has been a change to my numbers on the previous year. Okay, so what I mean by that is when I look at this report, if I see my retained earnings under RE with a number and I don't see retained earnings, then I know for a fact the numbers have not been changed. However, let's say, for example, somebody went in there and we went back to last year and created a random transaction that is going to affect those retained earnings. So let me go ahead and just create a random transaction, and let me just move them here so you can actually see the effect of that once I save it. So once, and I want to make sure, make this smaller here. Perfect. And I want to make sure that once I hit save on this check, that you're kind of focused on this retained earnings number. So I'm going to hit save and close. And then you'll see that the RE number, the one that I adjusted, is the same, but then something else appeared under the old retained earnings with a dollar amount. So basically what that tells you is that something was changed or modified after I created that adjustment. So typically what I would do is, to be able to really quickly pinpoint what was changed and modified after that, is I go back to my original journal entry, and I'll take a look at my journal entry. There it is. And I'll click on customize report, and I'll click on last entered modified and hit OK. And then I take a look at when this was created and modified. So I just kind of focused on, what day of the year and time and everything else. When was this journal entry made? When was this journal entry modified? And then I can actually double click on this retained earnings number, right, which is, and I click on all, and I see that there's no modifications made to my retained earnings. So if there is, I can actually monitor, if there's further modifications. However, what I'm really focused in is trying to pinpoint where that 600 came from. So I can use it in combination with an audit trail. So I can go into reports, accountant, and I can click on audit trail. And then basically under customize, I'll make this smaller here, under customize, under dates. So I'm looking for something that was changed or modified before that lock-in period where I made that adjustment. So I'm going to click there last fiscal year, and then they entered and modified, then I can actually choose the specific date where this was entered or modified. So let's say that was the actual specific date where it was modified, because I'll get to see it based on when I did that adjustment. And then I'll pick that date, and then I'll pick this somewhere in the future. So basically I'm looking for any transactions that were dated last year. This is before I created that journal entry, that they were modified or changed after I made that journal entry. So then when I hit OK, I should be able to see a much smaller audit trail, and I'll be able to pinpoint which transaction possibly made that difference. And there's the $600 transaction. And the last three custom reporting techniques I want to show you are pulling up an invoice profitability whenever I have an inventory item sold. And then another a real tricky one is, how do I pull an invoice profitability for when items are not sold, but they do have a cost component, and that's also for inventory. And the third one is for reporting on non-posting cost. So let me start with pulling up invoice profitability report whenever I have inventory sold. So let me start with a new invoice here, and then I'll just pick any customer at random. And I'll pick an inventory part. So I'm going to scroll down and do inventory part here, cabinet pulls, and then I'll sell 100 of these. And let's say I'm selling them for $25 each. Okay, just a quick invoice here. Now when I hit save, okay, and then I hit Control Y, okay, that's to a journal. That's going to give me, that would allow to give me the cost information on top of the sales information. So if actually I scroll here to the right, I can see my cost component in this case is $255 and my sales price is $2,500. However, nowhere here I can really just see what my profit is. So in order to see what my profit is, I would go to Customize Report and click on filters, and then I want to make sure that instead of showing all accounts, I'm showing income and cost of goods sold. So I'm looking for that particular, there it is, income and cost of goods sold. That way I'm just focused on displaying income and cost of goods sold, and then I hit OK. Okay, so we're getting there. Okay, so we need one more component here, which is I go back to Customize Report, and then on the column here I'm going to look for balance, and then I click OK. And basically this is how you get your profitability. The profit on this particular invoice is $2,244. The other one is, what if I want to know the profitability of an invoice, but I am not really selling these inventory parts. I'm using them as materials, and what I'm selling is just labor. So let's pull an example of that. So let me pull up QuickBooks, and let me go ahead and pull up an invoice, and I'll create a new invoice. And then let's say that I'm selling strictly labor, that I'm just selling the service. I'm going to click on installation here, and this is going to be $1,000 installation. However, I want to include the cost of some of the components of some of the parts that I'm using, but I'm not going to charge them to my client. So I'm going to hit the item drop down here, and let's say I'm going to use some doorknobs, and then I'm also going to use some exterior doors and that sort of thing. So I'm going to use 3 of these and 4 of these. Now the trick behind it is I don't want to charge my client for it. So what I do is here where it says rate, I change that to 0, and here where it says rate, I change that to 0. So what that would do is avoid including the sales price of those components, but because they are being sold, the cost is going to be in there. So I'm going to go ahead and click on save, and then I'll press Control Y, same as the last example, and I'll hit on Customize Report, Filter, and then under Account, I'm looking for all income and cost of goods sold, same exact example as I used before, okay? And then I'm gonna go to Display and show that balance column, and then I'll click OK, and I'll just get rid of a couple of columns here. That way it's a lot easier to get to that end result that we're looking at there. So the end result we're looking at is this is my profit on this deal. In this case, well, in this case it's actually negative because you see that profit in this report is shown as negatives. So in this case, $314 of balance is a loss. So this is how I know that I'm actually losing in this deal. And the only way to really know is through this report, because otherwise I would have had to actually take a look at what's the cost component of these items. So I would have to have gone into the actual item, not this way, but I'll hit Control L. I would have to have gone into each item and see, well, my cost component is $300. So by selling 4 of these, that already moves me to $1,200 cost. So unfortunately, because the cost component is not really part of the invoice, and if you are selling it at 0, you will need that specific report to know. So that was actually a pretty cool example that we actually got a losing deal, a losing deal. Okay, the last one I want to talk about is reporting non-posting cost on invoices. So the purpose of this is that I want to record an expense on an invoice for the purpose of knowing my profit, but I don't really want it to affect my books in any way. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what I did. So when I go into my list menu and I went into my item list, I actually created 2 items. One item, it's a service. Okay, so that's very important. That one has to be a service. And I created it and I named it non-posting cost, and I have it going into the cost of goods sold account. And then the other item I created is actually a very similar one. So I'm going to go down. This one's going to be an other charge, and that's probably the most important component. You got to make both of them different. So one's a service, the other one's another charge. I call this one pretty similar. I just called it non-posting cost reversal. And then under the account, I put it to cost of goods sold. So what I do with this is I create an invoice, and let me just pick a random customer here, and I'll pick a service that I'm selling, installation. And then, like I mentioned before, this is not really something that I'm actually selling a product that I'm trying to know the cost of it. I'm just trying to register some non-posting expenses so then I can later on monitor the profit. So I would use those 2 items there, this one called non-posting cost, and then the other one that I called it non-posting cost reversal. And remember, the second item is an other charge, and the first item is a service. So I wanna add a non-posting cost of $375, and I'm gonna put that as negative, right? Because in an invoice, a positive is income and a negative would be like a cost. And then I'm gonna reverse it. Okay, so basically I'm still going to have $1,000 invoice, and then I'll show you how to hide those in a second. So I'm still going to have $1,000 invoice. So when I click on save and I hit Control Y, and then I go back to the same principles here, I go to customize report, filters, and I look for all income and cost of goods sold, right? We're working off the same concept here. However, in this particular case, and let me collapse this particular case, the positive and the negative are both going to show, and the only way to filter it out is now using item filter. So because the items that I'm selling are service, and the items that I'm including as a non-posting cost are service, what I can do is I can go into item here, and I will filter it so it only shows services. So in this case, it's going to filter out the other charge, and then I'll be able to know what, and I just have to make sure that I add that last one, because that's the one that calculates my profit. And then by doing that, I can actually see that my quasi profit, right, the one that I'm just trying to calculate, it's 625. So that's just kind of a way for you to do that. Now, unfortunately, if I do this and then I go print this invoice and show it to my customer may be very confused about this non-posting cost. So the way to solve this is to create a new item that is a group, and then we'll call this internal cost. And then using this group for internal cost, then I just have to recall those 2 items that I used as the example here. So I'm gonna pick each one, and one I put it as a positive and the other one as a negative, and that's kind of how they will net out to zero. So I'm going to put this one quantity 1, and this one, actually this the cost component will be -1, and the other one will be +1, and then I hit OK. And I can go ahead and just get rid of these two. That way they're not showing anymore. Okay, and then in here inside the group itself, then I can put the -375 and the +375. That is going to in this case net out to see, in this case it should net out to 0. Actually this should be 375. That's already the -1, it's already driving that, so I don't need to put a negative there. So that will drive that to 0. When I do a print preview, you will see that that line doesn't show up at all. It just kind of shows that 0 there. That's kind of the beauty of groups. And when I hit save, and again, I pull the profitability report by hitting Control Y and then going into customize, and then I gotta pull up the balance filter, and then I go to account, and I go to all income and cost of goods sold. And I think we beat this one, this dead horse, pretty deeply. So it should be pretty obvious by now that I really like this style of custom reporting. So by doing that last one, then I get to see it. So this is basically, in a nutshell, one of my favorite custom reports to build, which is using the inner workings of an invoice and the items to create reports that you couldn't pull in